Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Wednesday evening, doing a review on a paper that Bishop Hilarion, of course, a well-known Russian Orthodox bishop, Bishop Hilarion Alfayev, a paper that he did, I want to say in 2003. And it is on ecumenical councils and their reception in the early church. And I've been reading a lot of articles and scholarly papers on reception theory. Kamiakov is next, but I reviewed Father Florovsky, I want to say last week, and today, of course, we're doing Hilarion. Hopefully next week I'll do something on Kamiakov, but I also actually plan to do a review of a pro-papacy paper by Martin Jugi, I guess is how you say his name. You see his name come up all the time, but you don't hear it mentioned audibly a whole lot. But a paper that he wrote, of course, supporting the papal claims, and he uses Pope Leo the Great to substantiate his claim. So I'm going to be reviewing that paper. But as far as a reception, I'm going to be doing this one with Bishop Hilarion, then, of course, Kamiakov, and some more coming down the line. So stay tuned on those. Now, I wrote the review earlier today on the website ratioapologetics.com. Y'all should be familiar with the Reason and Theology website where I do these shows, but I also have a personal apologetics website where I just jot down some thoughts on occasion in different papers that I'll write. I might post there. And I want to pull it up on the screen and maybe go over it and interact with some of the things that Bishop Hilarion has said. Let me see if I can pull it up here. Okay. Well, might not be very visible to you all. Let's see if I can maybe zoom in a little bit. Pretty sure there's a zoom in feature here. Okay. That should probably help. Let's see. Let me try a little bit more. I'm going to make sure that y'all can see the picture. And I'm just going to use that, as my notes for speaking here. So I'll just kind of review it myself and then give some commentary on it. So again, this was a paper that he published 2003. It's called The Reception of the Ecumenical Councils in the Early Church, published by St. Vladimir's Theological Quarterly. And of course, at first, he gives the purpose of the paper. And the purpose essentially is to explain how Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox could possibly reunite in the future and what this might mean when it comes to the ecumenical councils. Because, of course, the Oriental Orthodox, as most of y'all I'm sure already know, they only accept the first 3 ecumenical councils, whereas Eastern Orthodox accept the first 7 ecumenical councils. And then, of course, Roman Catholicism has, I want to say, 21. So there's a difference here between, Orthodoxy and Oriental Orthodoxy on ecumenical councils. And if there were to be reunion, who would have to give what? Who would have to accommodate whom? To what extent would the Oriental Orthodox have to embrace these other councils from Chalcedon onward? So that's kind of what he's addressing here. But while he addresses it, he has to go into several topics. What is an ecumenical council? How are they authoritative? So before he can really even get to the discussion between Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Oriental Orthodoxy, he has to really just discuss these things in general. So let's review that. He goes on to discuss what is an ecumenical council. In my opinion, he does not give a satisfactory answer. And from the outset, I'll tell you now, spoiler alert, he does not distinguish, between an imperial council and perhaps a binding or authoritative council. So he's not really distinguishing between the different ways in which ecumenical council could be understood. Because again, some people could just simply mean an imperial council. Others could mean a binding council. Now, how it might be binding is going to be different, right, between Catholics and Orthodox. So how it might be binding is another matter, but that it is binding in a certain non-administrative sense is certain. At least he's taking that much for granted. So I'm not going to be going into really the differences between an imperial council versus perhaps a universal, general, authoritatively binding council, because he really just doesn't take that up here. He does quickly allude to it when he speaks about the Robert Council, but again, it's not really addressed here. He's assuming that what you mean by ecumenical council is not only imperial, but also something that every Christian has to believe. Let's put it that way. Because he's essentially arguing here that there's a certain extent that the Oriental Orthodox, to have full communion with the Eastern Orthodox, are going to have to believe the rest of the councils in a very qualified sense, and we'll see how he qualifies it. All right, but he's first to define what a ecumenical council is not. So he doesn't initially tell us what it is. He tells us it's not the highest authority in the church. It's not something administrative and objective. It's more something that you could call it an authority, but it has to be ratified or digested or embraced by each local church. And whenever a local church receives that ecumenical council as authoritative, then it is authoritative in that local church, not for the rest of orthodoxy. And we're going to see some problems with that in a little bit, but I'll hold off on those comments for now. He essentially says it's an ecumenical council. What it is it's an inner Orthodox forum to coordinate activities of the autocephalous churches. So what is binding in each autocephalous local church? The local synod and its head. So you have the synod and the head of that local church working in symphony. And when they come to a conclusion on a matter of doctrine, for instance, that's binding on that local church. So what an ecumenical council isn't something to be necessarily the highest authority in the church to determine what is binding on each local churches, but it's more there to coordinate activities of the autocephalous churches. And only when their decisions are digested in the local council, local church by local councils, only then does it become binding. So it's not the ecumenical council that makes it binding, but more the reception that each local church through its council has that makes it authoritative and binding. So he says that ecumenical councils never had an inherent authority that were binding on all local churches. This was never the case. That's arguable, but this is the position he takes. He does start to talk a little bit about, the reception of Chalcedon a little bit later on. But one thing I wanted to point out here is he doesn't really deal with the problem of Chalcedon and that it wasn't received. He acknowledges it's a problem. He says it actually, later on in the article, he notes it was never fully received. It's still incomplete as far as reception, but he doesn't really deal with, okay, then why are you considering it an ecumenical council? It's presumed that, well, because these local churches have digested it and embraced it as ecumenical, that it's binding. But how does that fare with, let's say, Father Florovsky, that says all of the local churches have to first ratify and receive and digest that ecumenical council before it can be considered an authoritative or binding council, if you will? So there is a difference here. It seems that Hilarion is just saying, if that local council, that local church receives the ecumenical council, then it's binding on that local church. And it doesn't necessarily have to be ratified or accepted by all the other local churches for it to be considered authoritative in that local church. Again, this is a big problem, that indifference that I think I see with Hilman Florovsky, and he just doesn't really take this up and address it. So I thought that was worth noting. Okay, so he also notes how ecumenical councils are a quote, cooperation between the Holy Spirit and humans. And then he goes on to admit basically there's no inherent way to really know where the work of the Holy Spirit begins and where the work of man begins, where the work of the Holy Spirit is and what is work of man. He doesn't really engage this, and it's a problem because I think that he leaves this major gap open here that liberal theologians can drive a huge truck through, to basically say, well, we don't really know what part of the ecumenical council is the work of the Holy Spirit versus what part is the work of man. Liberals gonna have a field day with that kind of ambiguity. I'm not saying that there isn't some difference between, let's say, the work of the Holy Spirit and perhaps the way in which humans, well, now I don't want to say enshrined it, but expressed it at the ecumenical council. There is a distinction there. But to just say, we really don't know at all where this thing starts and ends, I think is a major blunder. I wish he talked more about it there, but he doesn't. All right, so he goes on to explain how there were seemingly contradictory differences in expressing the dogmas of Christ's two natures and one hypostasis between Ephesus and Chalcedon. So he basically says, look, there is a truth that Ephesus and Chalcedon were getting at when it comes to Christ's two natures and one hypostasis. There's a truth there about Christ, but the way they expressed it are contradictory. And I assume he means seemingly contradictory. I'll go ahead and just charitably say that he means seemingly and not a true contradiction. But he says, they look contradictory, but they're essentially getting at the same thing. And this is important because later on, this is going to apply to Oriental Orthodoxy, where he's going to claim that, the Oriental Orthodox can still maintain their language, and the Eastern Orthodox can still maintain their language when it comes to the nature or natures of Christ and his hypostases. Neither one has to give up their language. They just have to recognize that they're saying the same thing in substance. So that's why he brings that up there. All right, so then he addresses reception of ecumenical councils in the early church. So he turns his attention towards the reception of ecumenical councils, and he says that the whole community must accept the council. Now, it's unclear exactly what he means by whole community, because you might ask, okay, do you mean whole community as far as every local church, or do you mean whole community as far as every category of person in a local church? And it seems that it's the latter, because he seems to define it as church authorities, theologians, monks, and laypersons. That's the whole community. And that's what has to really receive an ecumenical council before it's really considered authoritative. Even though it might have the Holy Spirit working at the council, it's not something that happens retroactively. The Holy Spirit was really working at the council. But to know that the Holy Spirit was working at the council, the local church has to make that known by receiving it. But again, it's still unclear. What does he mean by whole community? Is he just saying the whole community of the local church has to ratify it, or the whole community of all local churches have to ratify it before it receive it, before it is authoritative? I should say receive rather than ratify. So forgive me for that slip there. I think that he is saying the local churches, as far as the whole community within it, is what has to receive this in order for it to be authoritative within that local church, just because that seems to be the context of the paper. But I mentioned that ambiguity there because, again, I think it demonstrates he has a difference there seemingly with Father Florovsky. And why do I keep bringing him up? Because I think Father Florovsky's views on the reception of ecumenical councils, that all the local churches have to receive it, is not just his view, but is the view of many Orthodox. So this is indicating that there's some wide divergence between orthodoxy on what exactly is reception. What does it mean that an ecumenical council has been received? There's different understandings of what reception is. There's not one monolithic view. So there's a problem here. We need clarification by anybody who wants to maintain reception theory in orthodoxy. We need clarification on what exactly is meant here by reception, just the local church or all local churches. And why should we believe one over the other? All right, so he mentions key factors that affected the reception of ecumenical councils by local churches. He mentions that there's theological trends that may have been going on in that local church. There could have been personal feuds that were going on. He mentions the feud between Cyril of Alexandria and John of Antioch. There's all kinds of reasons that would perhaps inhibit reception, and he goes to some of what those impediments are. He also mentions that, it could just take time for something to be received. That's one of the impediments. Time. How much time, is needed for something to be said to have been or not been received? He leaves that open. All right, then he goes into some historical examples. He first deals with the Council of Nicaea, and he says, look, Council of Nicaea was hotly debated right after Nicaea. And in many cases, it wasn't received, especially in the East, until 410. So, and then, of course, much later in parts of the Western Empire with the barbarians, right? You still have that fight going on into the late 500s, so late 6th century. So it could clearly take a very long time for something to be received. And this is problematic because, again, if you believe the whole church has to accept the ecumenical council for it to have been received, then you have a major problem with Nicaea because the whole church didn't accept it until way, 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 way later. So there's an issue there. So he then turns his attention to Ephesus 449. This is the Robber Council, and he says this council identified itself as ecumenical. But the reason why it's not ecumenical is because the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, in 449 rejected it and dismissed it, said it is invalid, and then the other local churches followed suit. So what he basically says is, well, the way we know that this was an invalid council is Rome refuted it. Rome basically declared it was invalid, and the rest of the churches followed Rome on the matter. And this is a very curious admission because, okay, well, how does this maybe speak to ecumenical councils in the future? How do we know whether something is ecumenical? Is the role of Rome ratifying it absolutely essential? Is it absolutely crucial to where you can no longer have an ecumenical council unless Rome ratifies it? These are questions that go unanswered, unfortunately, by the bishop. Then he addresses Chalcedon. Of course, that's what we're really waiting on. And he says, this has really never been accepted by the entire ecumene, right? The entire empire. Well, yeah, he's right, because all local churches did not receive it. There were many local churches that did not receive Chalcedon, and that's the case until this very day, which is a major problem for Father Florovsky. Might not be as much of an issue for Father Hilarion, but I still don't see how the Father Florovsky gets around that one. But anyways, after that, he starts dealing with a history of Chalcedon, and again, he once more makes the admission the reception of Chalcedon is incomplete. Now, that's a pretty large admission right there. It's incomplete. But he doesn't elaborate that much further. He moves on. He goes to the Council of Florence Ferrara, and he says, look, all the delegates were there for all the churches. They were present. The only one also in the end who didn't sign was St. Mark, according to Bishop Hilarion. That's disputable, but that's his position. And he says this council, quote, had all the characteristic traits of an ecumenical council. But of course, he doesn't take the idea that there's any objective way to identify an ecumenical council. So for him, that's not sufficient. So how does he get around, Council of Florence Ferrara not being ecumenical? Well, what he does is he says, okay, well, the Metropolitan Isidore of Moscow, 2 years after signing the Act of Union, after the Orthodox churches signed the act and have, at least temporarily received it and gone home, the Metropolitan was celebrating the Divine Liturgy, And during the liturgy, he commemorated the Pope and read the Act of Union. And he mentions all the bishops were asleep. They didn't care. It wasn't an issue. No voices of opposition were heard. Shortly after that, the Prince of Moscow says, you know what, I don't like that. And he calls Isidore a heretic, has him arrested. And then guess what all the Russian bishops did at that point? They then said, oh, well, yeah, Isidore, you're a heretic for this. And they, of course, repudiated him and the union. So in other words, this was only repudiated when the political authorities pressured the metropolitan to repudiate the Act of Union. So it's very interesting. He does not mention how this could still be considered a legitimate repudiation. Some have suggested, well, perhaps Symphonia, the secular authority is also there to symphonically safeguard the faith, but of course that wasn't done when it comes to icons. At some periods of times later on, you have an empress who's in favor of them and safeguards the faith, but you had several emperors who were not in favor of that, including the bishops at the time. So you didn't have Symphonia working very well there, and it was, of course, the Pope who was safeguarding the faith of icons at the time. So not sure how he can explain that repudiation born by political pressure was legitimate, but perhaps there are good answers. He just doesn't give them to us. And then he goes on to note, well, after the Russians repudiated the union, all the other councils, local churches, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, they all followed suit. So after that, Hilarion gives us 9 theses on the nature of ecumenical councils and their significance today. Number 1, I'm just going to read these to you because they speak for themselves, because I already kind of summarized them here. Verbal alterations can be made to the dogmas of ecumenical councils. And this is an important admission. I think that all sides have already really admitted this, though. I don't know how you can hold to the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed without really maintaining that, unless you're saying, well, an verbal alteration can be made, but it has to be made by an ecumenical council. Now, some will say even an ecumenical council can't do it because Chalcedon gave a canon saying that you can't alter the creed, but that canon was essentially talking about setting up a creed in opposition to the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. So it wasn't saying that you couldn't elaborate further. It was just basically saying you shouldn't set up anything in opposition to it. At least that's my understanding. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Now, he goes ahead and admits this. Verbal alterations can be made to the dogmas of ecumenical councils. And why is this important? Because he's going to later on establish that Oriental Orthodoxy can be received by Eastern Orthodox into full communion if they simply affirm that the dogma itself is not contradictory to their dogma. They don't necessarily have to affirm the language or the words. They just have to affirm the substance of the doctrine. All right, if a local church did not participate in an ecumenical council, then it does not have to accept it as its own. And again, he's mentioning this because he's basically going to say the Oriental Orthodox do not have to accept councils 4 through 7 as their own. They just need to express that it doesn't contradict anything in their dogmas. But they don't have to act like this is their own council when they weren't there. That's also important because this has some implications with Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox dialogue. If there were to be a reunion, that's an important admission. And if Roman Catholics agree with it, there's a certain sense in which Eastern Orthodox would not have to accept any council after the 7th council as their own. They would only have to affirm the substance of what is being taught, but not necessarily the words. All right, moving on. Point 3. Historical events can be reinterpreted provided there is no new information that would warrant the change. Provided that there is new information that would warrant the change. For example, the acts of an ecumenical council can be reconsidered based on new material. So if new material surfaces that wasn't available to the ecumenical council, they can reevaluate some of the historical decisions that were made at the Ecumenical Council. Also, a pretty big admission there. The overturning of something in a qualified sense that was established by an ecumenical council is not contrary to the Holy Spirit's work at an ecumenical council, as even the fifth council overturned the reception of the three chapters. So, of course, the three chapters died in peace, if you will, accepted by the fourth council, but the fifth council retroactively condemns them. So it overturned something that a previous ecumenical council had established, if you will. So he's saying that in this qualified sense, you can have an overturning of something decided by an ecumenical council, as we see with the fifth and fourth council. All right, condemned theologians at an ecumenical council can be rehabilitated. And why is this important? Well, Dioscorus, maybe. Right? I mean, he's condemned. I don't think the Oriental Orthodox are going to be happy about that one, so they can be rehabilitated. Ecumenical councils can be reconsidered, as Cyril and John's reunion council was an overturning of the third council, according to him at least. So there are some reconsiderations that can be made with ecumenical councils, because you have Cyril and John with their 433 with their council where they reunite. He says that their reunion was basically an overturning of the third council in a qualified sense. You might not agree with him, but this is the example he uses. The Horos of the fifth council reinterpreted the fourth council, and the fifth council reinterpreted the orthodoxy of Evos and Theodoret. So those are the examples he gives. Ecumenical councils can be read critically as the church develops. There's a very loose, qualified sense in which he affirms some development here. Not a full-blown development of doctrine, but he does want to say that the church develops, and with this development, we can critically read the ecumenical councils. Very big admission, in my opinion. The heritage given by ecumenical councils can be appropriated to new historical periods. Can and should be even newly appropriated. And now we start to get into, the liberal language where, the liberal theologians, they love to speak about new ways to appropriate a doctrine. So, of course, the bishop here is not liberal, but he's starting to lean towards that kind of language that liberals would have a field day with. Communion and unity should be placed over dogmatic formulations to an extent. He's not going to say, look, I mean, communion and unity is just so supreme that we can have fundamental dogmatic differences. He's not saying that. That's not what he's saying. But what he is saying is that we do not have to place unnecessary barriers that would perhaps be obstacles and barriers to communion and unity. And he cites St. Basil, and he basically says, Basil with the Macedonians, all he was saying is that, they don't even have to accept the dogmatic formulation that the Holy Spirit is consubstantial with the Father. They don't have to accept we don't have to put any dogmatic binding formulations on them. They just don't need to say that he's a creature, and that's enough. It's more important for us to have union and communion, and through that unity and sharing of the sacraments, we will then come to a better understanding of each other, and there really won't be any matter of divergence over a long period of time of us sharing communion. So again, Basil is kind of saying, okay, it's not that, we can just have absolute dogmatic differences, but let's not add dogmatic formulations that don't have to be added, that would then unnecessarily divide people when it comes to communion and unity. Why is this important? Of course, because this is relevant to any Orthodox who insists no Oriental Orthodox have to say these words, the Chalcedonian definition. You have to say these words, and unless you say these words, you're anathema. So He then deals with possible objections. I'm not really going to get into them. There's two major objections, but they weren't really very pertinent here. But he does mention the same dogmatic truth can be formulated differently. That was a very interesting point that he admitted. The same dogmatic truth can be formulated differently. And I can't say I would disagree with this, but this is very, very interesting admission, because this also has a lot of relevance to Orthodoxy and Catholicism. Perhaps some of the dogmatic truths that were decided upon by Catholics could be formulated differently, in a sense that is more palatable to Orthodoxy. And likewise, some things that were formulated by Orthodoxy could be, or decided by Orthodoxy, could be reformulated or formulated differently for Catholics. But again, here the immediate context is in relation to Oriental Orthodox. But if it's true for them, it's also true for Roman Catholics. All right. He then goes on to define what is a universal church and how to identify ecumenical councils. He basically says for Catholics, a unity is guaranteed by the papacy. That's how you identify universality. And that's what guarantees universality in Catholicism. Whereas for Orthodoxy, universality revolves around different autonomous local churches just simply recognizing each other as one body. And then he goes on to say, well, for the Catholics to identify an ecumenical council, you need papal ratification. But for Orthodox, you have to have reception. And again, he doesn't deal with, okay, well, some of the inner Orthodox debates between what exactly constitutes reception. He just doesn't deal with it. He just throws it out there. And he also doesn't deal with how his ecclesiology matches the ecclesiology of the first millennium, which is a point worth noting here, because, of course, his ecclesiology is going to say that you can have some local churches in communion with other local churches who are not maybe in communion with each other. And this idea of a partial schism or partial communion, although you see it in the early church, he doesn't explain how the fullness or universality of the church is still maintained in that. In my opinion, that is a very good example of the Catholic understanding of partial communion. That to me is an admission of partial communion. But if one is not going to admit that, he doesn't really go into any more detail and explain. Then he notes Orthodoxy does not have an administrative guarantee of Orthodox doctrine as Catholicism has, but instead has a non-administrative structure that hinges on unanimity. And again, he doesn't really deal here with the fact that, well, Chalcedon wasn't unanimously agreed upon. Neither was Nicaea. Neither were all kinds of councils, especially though Chalcedon. It was not unanimous. There was a major, major issue there. And again, Florovsky admits this. There's a huge portion of the church at that time, the universal church at that time, that did not receive Chalcedon. There was not unanimity. So for him to say that, all right, the doctrines of the church, they hinge on unanimity, he just throws it out there but doesn't really explain it. To me, I was left very unsatisfied. All right. Then he goes on, is it necessary for the Oriental Orthodox to accept these 7 ecumenical councils? And this is towards the end of the paper. He's tying all the points together, and he's going to explain that Oriental Orthodox have to accept the theology of the 7 ecumenical councils, but not necessarily their formula. He argues that Oriental Orthodoxy, they don't necessarily have to say that the dogmas that the 4th and through 7th councils decided on, that the dogmas are their own. They just have to say that the dogmas of the 4th through 7th council do not contradict their own dogmas. That's all. He also says Oriental Orthodoxy can continue to use their terminology about Christ, his nature, and so on. They can continue to use their terminology as their terminology was accepted by the 3rd Ecumenical Council. Now, I know a lot of people are going to disagree with that one, but there it is. All right. Then he goes on to note how St. Isaac of Nineveh and St. Peter of Iberia are both saints in Eastern Orthodoxy, yet both of them lived outside of communion from the Orthodox, and both of them either rejected Ephesus and Chalcedon or both. So Saint Isaac rejects Chalcedon and Ephesus, and Saint Peter rejects Chalcedon, and they lived outside of communion. And in fact, he mentions that Saint Peter fought against Chalcedon. So he says, look, if these guys can be saints and they're rejecting entire ecumenical councils, why can't we bend a little towards the Oriental Orthodox and give them at least enough space to say we can allow for some differences in dogmatic formulations, and also we can have some re-examinations of the condemnations of certain people at Chalcedon. So that's overall his point. Overall, he's a great author. I loved his writing style. He was very, very engaging. Never at any point in the article did I feel bored, and that's very important. There's a lot of authors I read. I just want to just say, okay, I can't finish this. It's just too boring. It might be important what they're saying, but I just can't move on. I can't bear with this. I can't bear through this. Well, Bishop Hilarion is not one of those. He writes in a very, very engaging style. He's very interesting, provides all kinds of really good historical insights, things that are very thought-provoking. But ultimately, I do not think he adequately defines what is an ecumenical council or how to identify one. It's obviously the case that he does not believe there is any objective or consistent way to identify an ecumenical council. The most he gives us is, well, the local council has to receive it. Okay, well, what if the local council doesn't receive it? Is it now okay? So since this or that church didn't receive Chalcedon, are they perfectly fine the way they are? I mean, surely he wouldn't argue that. So, I mean, are the Coptics okay? They didn't receive Chalcedon. So is it perfectly fine the state in which they are currently in? No, they obviously, he would argue they need something more. Okay, well, what is that more that they need? He doesn't give us anything objective or consistent. And so this is why I think he and Father Florovsky's theories of reception so far just don't leave us with anything objective. Father Florovsky, as I've noted before, already admitted his position is circular. He already admitted he does not have any objective way to identify what's an ecumenical council or what is true versus heretical doctrine. He doesn't have a way. It's entirely subjective. Fair enough. That's what he says it is. And frankly, if there's nothing better that can be offered that is historical, that might be what we're just left with, and we just have to deal with it. But if there is something better, if there is something objective, and if there is something also just as historical, wouldn't it be reasonable to go with that which is objective rather than that which is subjective and circular? Just throwing that out there. We're going to be dealing with that at another time, though, so I'll leave that there. Again, overall, I enjoyed it, but I was still left very unsatisfied in the end. Like I said, I'm going to be doing more reviews of Orthodox on reception and then some reviews on the papacy. Again, Martin Jugi on the papacy and Pope Leo, he argues universal jurisdiction was not only taught but also practiced by Leo, and that not only was it taught and practiced by Leo, but others in the East accepted it, acquiesced to it, bowed to it, the whole nine. So I'll be addressing that in the future, and frankly, after that, many more article and video reviews to come. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I really appreciate the support that y'all give here. Please comment, like, subscribe, share this information on your social media as much as you can. Just get the word out there. We're trying to do as much as we can to provide different perspectives when it comes to theology in a non-polemical way. So again, share it on your social media. Again, subscribe. And thank you all for watching. God bless you all.